The wheel bearing. It brings us so much joy, but causes so much pain. I had this supercharger whine sound emanating from the back of my Porsche, and I knew that the wheel bearing was amiss. So I had to think of something creative to make this anew. Instead of buying expensive parts from the dealership or doing something crazy, I said, hey, what if I was able to find regular parts from a local hardware store and create something very exciting? Could I change a bearing using those components? Well, I did, and this is what came to be. Okay, some new items you need here is a 2-inch conduit coupler, ideally electrical part. A 3-inch conduit coupler, could be PVC. You need a 1-inch floor flange, which is also a plumbing part, a 1/2-inch floor flange, plumbing part as well. You will need 4 of the 1/2-inch washers, 2 of the 1-inch washers. You would need a threaded rod, which is 1/2 inch by 12 inches, and 2 1/2-inch nuts to go with it. You need an 8mm, very nice unit there, a 17 and a 13, and in my case, a 30mm socket to remove a big one, and a 19mm wrench, and some pliers, needed those pliers. And of course, a handy impact. So first I'll take off the cotter pin there, which was there before. If it's in good shape, you can reuse it. If not, put a new one in. Remove my nut from the axle itself, put that aside. I have these beautiful StopTech brakes, so my 19mm wrench is good enough for the activity there to remove it. And very soon I'll have that off. Now, to keep it from dangling and getting in trouble, I need something fancy. So I use a Pura box that's empty just to lay the caliper on. Now, if you do have any kind of bolts to hold in place, you remove those, but in this case, mine slides right off with a StopTech brake disc. I'm using a pry bar here to hold my brake assembly or hub assembly in place while I remove the axle nuts with my nice hex 8mm, and I have quite a few of those. They were quite snug on there, so I was able to take that off. Used an extension with another hex socket to take off the innards to the motor. Okay, now to make things nice and back in place, I marked my axle and the stub, and then I used like just 2 breaker bars to try and pull the hub out. Came off. Wow, yay, success. Okay, now my 13mm socket, oh, you see that little device there? That has to come off afterwards. I'll show you how I pulled that off. That's half the bearing race. 13mm socket to take off the little cap for the nice little wheel bearing. And that comes off. I marked the top so I can put it in the right location again. There is a little threaded rod that holds the drum brakes. Yes, old school Porsches have drum brakes in place. And then I gradually pull apart the ends of the drum pads and take off the assembly easily. Now, I take the very nice 2-inch conduit coupler in the rear and the 3-inch in the front. So the 3-inch in the front is going to act as a receiver. And I put the threaded one through, put both, double up on the washers so you don't decay them or mess them up. And then you tighten up the threaded rod, the rear's in place, and you just pull forward, and voila! That easily, the old bearing comes right out. Look at that. Yeah, look at that. Smells good too, right? No, it doesn't. Anyway, okay. So you remove all your handmade tools. You get the new FAG bearings, what I used, FW161 or 527243CA. Okay. Brand new, nice, has nice movement to it, nice plastic bag. I feel it's very good. I put a little lubrication around it, and I'm going to use the old bearing as a guide for me. They're the exact same size, so it should help me very nicely. Now this time I placed the 3-inch conduit coupler in the rear. I follow up with a 1-inch floor flange in the rear as well. And then using my double agent half washers, I put that in the back of it and use the threaded rod to allow me to, in this case, pull the new bearing back in. So now here we go from the rear, sliding the thread rod, and with a little bit of manipulation you can get it as center as possible. I gently put in the new one, and then I follow up with the old one. Because I don't want to mangle my new beautiful bearing. That would be quite bad, right? So I put in the 1/2 inch floor flange and then the corresponding washers as well to give me some integrity. And then follow up with my 1/2 inch nut. All right. So I use my 19mm ratcheting wrench and I go on and on and on and on and on and on, and little by little the new bearing gets into its housing. Some people like to pound these in. That's very bad. You can really destroy a bearing quite easily. And I back off, and look, you feel it seating very nicely at the end. It won't go any further, you know you're there, and look at that. Beautiful, voila, nice and tidy. Because the old bearing transferred some rubbish to the new one. I don't like that. So I wipe my assembly down, place that back in place. My spring went south, but I'll grab it in a moment. There it is. Put the spring in. Put the little plate in that allows me to actuate the drum brakes. I have this small 10mm nut that will go through there. I tend to turn that by hand until I have a little area hole for the in a threaded rod that allows me to put in a new cotter pin. Put a corresponding cotter pin in, and we are now set. Okay. Now the plate goes in. Remember I marked it earlier, so I know what the upper location is. I put my bolts in, use my 13mm socket to then tighten it to a beautiful 18 foot-pounds of torque. And then remember how I couldn't get that other bearing race off? Well, I used a little puller that I had laying around to do that. And then, it's still not quite all the way off, so I have to think of something clever. I know. I will use a decent sized socket that will fit right inside. And it gets kind of tricky because the balancing is quite not to my liking, but with much persistence, I eventually get there, tighten it down, use my little 17mm socket and pull the race off, clean it up, lube it up just a little bit, and then place it right in place. Now I'm going to use my nice little homemade kit again to now pull the hub assembly towards the bearing very carefully. So I proceed again to use the 1-inch floor flange in the rear. Remember my 3-inch conduit coupler is still back there. So I place the thread rod through the hole again. Wow, this thread rod has gone through a lot today, hasn't it? Then I use the 1-inch washers with a 1/2 inch washer in the middle to give me some kind of integrity with the 1/2 inch nut and the thread rod. I use my 19mm socket to then thread inwards. And I won't go all the way because I'm going to use physics to my advantage. So I go far enough to whereby the hub moves in further for my nice little hub assembly to go in. So the rear hub assembly goes in, or stub, I should say axle stub, put in a nut, and I impact it on. Now, the proper torque spec for that is a little over 300 foot-pounds, so you can check what size your manual says, depending on your nut size, and you are good to go. Okay, depending on what axle bolt size you have, whether it's an M8 or M10, you may need to torque these down to either 30 or 60 pound for the torque. I'm using some leverage here to give me some very good torquing capability, and that worked out quite well. So now my axles are in place. Of course, I torqued the rear and front. Now I'm placing on the beautiful StopTech disc and the lovely lightweight aluminum caliper. And things are coming together very nicely. Torque the 219s in the rear, and things are very, very, very nice. Wow, this wasn't bad at all for about an hour's work.